He stood on the edge of the parking lot, his hands trembling, his eyes hollow with shame. The cardboard sign he held didn't ask for money. It asked for something far rarer. It read, "I don't want pity. I want a second chance." People passed without looking, their eyes trained on the ground, afraid to meet the gaze of a man the world had already labeled beyond redemption. But that day, fate sent a different kind of crowd his way. The deep rumble of engines signaled their arrival long before they appeared. One by one, motorcycles rolled to a stop beside him. The ex-con lowered his head, bracing himself for judgment. Yet, instead of scorn, he heard a voice, low, firm, and kind. "You've already served your time, brother," said the leader, a man with silver hair beneath a leather helmet. "Now it's time to serve your purpose." In that moment, the stranger realized he wasn't being looked down on. He was being invited to stand again. The bikers didn't ask for explanations. They didn't demand proof that he'd changed. They simply saw the humanity that prison had stripped away from him, the part of a man that still wanted to fight, not for freedom, but for forgiveness. They understood what it meant to be misunderstood, to carry the weight of mistakes heavier than the steel they rode on. And so, without hesitation, they made a choice that would change both his life and theirs. The man followed them that afternoon, not knowing where they were going. The highway stretched ahead like a promise. For the first time in years, the wind didn't feel cold. It felt cleansing. The rumble of engines beside him wasn't intimidating. It was comforting, like the heartbeat of a family he never thought he'd have again. Each mile they rode carried away a fragment of his guilt, replaced by something unfamiliar: hope. By the time they reached the old biker clubhouse on the outskirts of town, he could barely speak. The leader turned to him and said, "Everyone deserves a road back home. Let's start building yours." And as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the man who had once been discarded by the world finally found something he had lost long ago. Not freedom, not forgiveness, but belonging. The first night at the biker clubhouse was quiet. The ex-con sat alone by the fire, staring into the flames as if trying to burn away the past written across his skin. Around him, laughter echoed, bottles clinked, and stories filled the air. Yet, beneath the sound of joy, there was understanding. These men weren't saints. They carried scars too. And maybe that's why they didn't ask him to explain. They already knew what it felt like to fight demons that wore your own face. The leader, a man everyone called Iron Mike, handed him a plate of food and said simply, "Eat. Tomorrow you ride." There was no lecture, no speech about redemption. Just that. The ex-con hesitated, the words sinking deep. For years, people had told him what he couldn't do. But for the first time, someone was telling him what he could. He nodded, his throat tightening as he took the first bite of a meal, not given out of charity, but respect. That night, sleep didn't come easily. He lay awake on a worn couch, listening to the soft hum of motorcycles cooling outside. The scent of oil and leather filled the air, a strange comfort for a man who had slept on concrete floors for most of his life. He thought about all the faces that had turned away from him since he got out, the job interviews that ended the moment they saw his record, the doors that closed faster than he could knock. And yet, here, among men society feared, he felt safer than he ever had behind bars. The next morning, the roar of engines jolted him awake. The bikers were already lined up, waiting for him. Iron Mike tossed him a helmet. "Let's go," he said. "You can't rebuild a life sitting still." The words struck him like lightning. He climbed onto the back of a bike, gripping tightly as they rode through the dawn. The city blurred past them, the broken parts, the forgotten corners, the places that had once held him hostage. But this time, he wasn't running from them. He was passing through, heading somewhere new. The wind tore through his hair, carrying away pieces of his old self. Every mile they rode felt like a confession, every turn a small act of forgiveness. When they finally stopped at a construction site on the outskirts of town, Iron Mike turned and said, "You said you wanted a second chance. This is it. We're rebuilding this place for kids who don't have one." The ex-con stared at the half-finished structure, his chest tightening. For the first time in years, he realized he could build something again. The days turned into weeks, and the man who had once been lost in guilt began to rediscover purpose. The work was hard, cement, wood, sweat, but it was honest. His hands, once used for survival, now built something that would outlive him. Every nail hammered into that new youth center was a piece of redemption. Every wall raised a small victory over the life he thought he'd ruined. The bikers never treated him like a project. They treated him like a brother. And that made all the difference. At night, they would sit around the fire pit, trading stories. Most of the men had their own versions of rock bottom. War veterans, ex-addicts, outcasts. Each had faced a moment where the world decided they weren't worth saving. But together, they had rewritten their own fates. The ex-con listened, sometimes speaking, sometimes staying silent. But with each passing day, he found himself laughing more and doubting less. Redemption, he realized, wasn't a gift. It was a choice you had to keep making, over and over again. Still, the ghosts of his past didn't fade easily. Some nights, he woke in a sweat, haunted by the memory of what he had done. The mistake that had taken someone's life and stolen years from his own. He'd serve his time, but guilt doesn't recognize prison walls. One night, he confessed this to Iron Mike, his voice cracking under the weight. "I don't deserve this," he said. Mike just looked at him and replied, "None of us do. That's why we fight harder to keep it." The next morning, the bikers handed him a jacket. Black leather, heavy, with a single word stitched across the back, Brotherhood. He froze, unable to speak. They didn't give it to him as a symbol of perfection, but as proof of belonging. The man who had once been rejected by the world was now part of something greater than himself. He put the jacket on slowly, and, for the first time, it felt like wearing forgiveness. From that day forward, he worked differently. He carried himself taller, spoke with more conviction, and began to believe that maybe his story wasn't over yet. The world had branded him a criminal, but these men had taught him a deeper truth. Your past is a chapter, not your entire book. And as long as there's breath in your lungs, you still have time to write a better ending. The youth center began to take shape faster than anyone expected. Each morning, the sound of hammers echoed like music across the open field, a rhythm that marked rebirth, for the building and for the man rebuilding himself. Children from the nearby neighborhood often stopped to watch, their faces pressed against the chain-link fence. They didn't see an ex-con or a group of bikers. They saw heroes turning dust into something beautiful. And for the man who had once been feared, that was the most healing thing of all, to finally be seen for who he was becoming, not who he had been. One afternoon, a small boy approached the worksite carrying an old baseball glove. He looked up shyly and asked the ex-con if he knew how to play. The man hesitated, then smiled. "Yeah, I used to," he said. They tossed the ball back and forth for nearly an hour, and in that simple act, something sacred happened, a bridge between the man he once was and the man he wanted to be. It was as if forgiveness had taken the shape of a baseball flying through the air, back and forth, steady and patient. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the bikers gathered around a bonfire. The leader, Iron Mike, leaned back and said, "You know what people don't understand about second chances? You don't get them, you build them." The ex-con listened, every word sinking deeper into his chest. Redemption wasn't a door someone opened for you. It was a wall you tore down with your own hands, one brick at a time. The man had never known brotherhood before prison. Inside, trust was currency, and loyalty was a gamble. Out here, with these men, it was a way of life. Each one of them stood as living proof that brokenness could still hold value, that even scarred hands could lift someone else up. Around that fire, they weren't sinners or saviors. They were survivors, all building new roads from the ashes of old mistakes. As he looked around the circle, the man realized something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that grows from facing your past and still choosing to move forward. For the first time since his release, he wasn't haunted by the question, "Who am I?" He finally knew. He was a builder, a brother, and a man learning how to stand again. But not everyone believed in redemption. One morning, while the bikers worked, a group of locals arrived at the site, angry voices, holding signs that read, "Keep criminals out of our town." The ex-con froze, his chest tightening as old shame surged back to the surface. He had seen that look before, the one that stripped a man of his worth before he even spoke. The leader stepped forward calmly, facing the crowd without hostility. "We're not here to destroy your town," Iron Mike said. "We're here to rebuild what's been broken, starting with this place. The confrontation grew heated. Some shouted that criminals couldn't change, that forgiveness was for fools. The ex-con stood behind the group, trembling, wanting to disappear. But one of the children who had watched them work every day stepped forward, a little girl holding a hand-painted sign that read, "They're building this for us." The crowd fell silent. The innocence in her voice broke through years of cynicism in a single moment. The man felt tears sting his eyes as he watched the leader kneel to the girl's level. "That's right," Iron Mike said softly. "We're building this for you, and for everyone who needs a place to start over." The tension eased. The same people who had come to protest lowered their signs, some even joining in to help. That day, the community began to see what the man had already learned. Redemption doesn't happen in isolation. It happens when hearts change together. Later that evening, as the bikers packed up their tools, the ex-con approached Iron Mike and said quietly, "I almost ran today." The leader looked at him, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah," he said, "but you didn't. That's what matters." The man nodded, realizing that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to stand your ground when every voice, even your own, tells you to run. When the last rays of sunlight faded, the ex-con sat on the steps of the unfinished center, watching the stars appear one by one. He thought about all the walls that had once trapped him, both real and invisible. Now, he was helping to build walls that would shelter others. The irony wasn't lost on him. Maybe that was life's quiet mercy, to let a man rebuild the same world he once helped to break. Weeks passed, and the youth center began to look less like a construction site and more like a sanctuary. Fresh paint covered the walls, the scent of wood lingered in the air, and laughter began to echo through the open doors. Children from the neighborhood came daily, eager to help, eager to belong. For the ex-con, every brick he laid felt like rewriting his story. Each nail, each wall, a chapter of redemption he was finally proud to write. One afternoon, as he was sanding a wooden bench, a man approached him quietly. It took a moment for the ex-con to recognize him. It was the brother of the man whose life he had taken years before. His breath caught. The world seemed to narrow to that single moment. The brother stood still, eyes unreadable, before finally speaking. "I saw the news," he said softly. "They said you were helping build this place." The ex-con could barely nod. His voice failed him. "I hated you for years," the man continued. "I thought seeing you free would kill me inside. But when I saw what you were doing here, I realized something. My brother's gone. Nothing can change that. But what you're doing, maybe it's how you make peace with it." The ex-con's eyes filled with tears, his chest tightening with a mix of guilt and gratitude. He whispered, "I don't deserve forgiveness." The brother paused, then said, "You don't. But sometimes we give it anyway. Not for you, but for us." The two men stood in silence for a long time. The sounds of children laughing in the distance filled the space between them, bridging years of pain. When the brother finally walked away, the ex-con sat on the bench he had built, his hands trembling. For the first time, he didn't feel like a man running from his past. He felt like a man facing it. That night, he couldn't sleep. He went outside, sat by his motorcycle, and looked at the stars. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't a single moment. It was a lifetime of moments like this. Painful, humbling, and holy. It wasn't given because you asked for it. It was given because someone else chose mercy over hate. And that was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The day finally came when the youth center was complete. The grand opening drew people from every corner of the city, parents, children, volunteers, and even those who had once doubted the project. The air buzzed with music, laughter, and a sense of unity that felt almost sacred. The ex-con stood off to the side, still wearing his leather jacket with Brotherhood stitched across the back, unsure if he deserved to be celebrated. Iron Mike spotted him and waved him over. "You helped build this," he said. "You belong right here." The ex-con hesitated, but when the crowd began to clap, he stepped forward. The children ran toward him, grabbing his hands, pulling him to the front. Their smiles were pure, their joy contagious. In their eyes, he wasn't an ex-con. He was a builder, a protector, a man who had given them a place to dream. When it was time for speeches, Iron Mike took the microphone first. "This place," he said, was built by men who've made mistakes and learned from them. It's not just wood and brick. It's proof that no one is too far gone to do something right. The crowd erupted in applause, but then Mike turned to the ex-con. And this man here, he added, is living proof. The ex-con stepped up, his hand shaking. He looked out the faces, some still wary, others smiling. He took a deep breath and said, I used to think I'd never earn back my place in this world. But these men, he pointed to the bikers, and all of you showed me that redemption isn't about forgetting who you were. It's about fighting every day to be better than that. His voice cracked, but no one looked away. They listened in reverent silence. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. Children climbed onto his shoulders, the bikers cheered, and the man felt something he hadn't in decades. Peace, real peace. The youth center stood tall behind him, glowing in the sunset like a monument to mercy. It wasn't just a building. It was a promise that even broken lives can build beautiful things. In the weeks that followed the grand opening, the youth center became the beating heart of the community. Every day after school, children flooded through its doors, their laughter echoing down the halls that had once stood empty. Parents volunteered, local businesses donated supplies, and what began as a project of redemption grew into a living symbol of unity. For the ex-con, every smile he saw felt like proof that the past didn't have to define a man forever. It could, instead, become the soil where something good took root. He found himself mentoring the kids, teaching them simple carpentry, how to ride safely, and, more importantly, how to face mistakes without losing themselves to them. One afternoon, a teenage boy stayed behind after class. He confessed that his older brother had been arrested and that he felt like his family's future was over. The ex-con knelt down, looked the boy in the eye, and said, "One bad decision doesn't end your story. It just gives you a harder road to walk. But if you keep walking, you'll find people waiting to help you along the way." The boy nodded, and that small exchange planted another seed of hope. The bikers continued to visit, not as saviors, but as family. They cleaned the lot, fixed the fence, and rode with the children through the neighborhood on weekends. Every engine roar that once symbolized rebellion now represented protection, strength, and second chances. The town, once divided, began to heal in ways no one expected. It wasn't just a youth center that had been built. It was trust, brick by brick. But one afternoon, as the ex-con walked through the playground behind the center, he found a letter taped to the wall. It was anonymous, written in uneven handwriting. "My dad said people like you don't change, but I think he's wrong. You changed everything." He read the note over and over, his throat tightening with emotion. It was a reminder that the smallest acts, patience, kindness, consistency, were the ones that truly changed lives. That night, as the sun set, he rode with Iron Mike down the open highway, the wind cold but freeing. The leader glanced over and said, "You ever think you get this far?" The man smiled faintly beneath his helmet. "No," he replied, "but I think I finally understand what freedom means." It wasn't the absence of bars. It was the presence of purpose. Months turned into a year, and the youth center stood stronger than ever. The walls that once echoed with hammers now carried the laughter of children learning music, art, and teamwork. The community had rallied behind it, organizing events, fundraisers, and mentorship programs. It had become more than a building. It was a living promise that people could change, that darkness could give way to light if someone believed hard enough. The ex-con's story spread quietly beyond the town. A few journalists came, curious about the biker who rebuilt his life. But when they tried to make it about his past, he refused. "Don't write about what I did," he said. "Write about what we built." His humility only deepened the impact of the story. It wasn't about one man's redemption anymore. It was about the power of community, forgiveness, and faith in broken people. Still, every night, he returned to that same bench outside the center, the one where he had first met the victim's brother. Sometimes he would sit there alone, listening to the wind and remembering the road that brought him here. The guilt never disappeared completely, but it had changed shape. It no longer crushed him. It guided him. It reminded him to keep building, to keep giving, to never take peace for granted. The bikers never let him forget where he came from. They kept him grounded with tough love and quiet wisdom. One evening, Iron Mike looked at him and said, You know why we helped you, right? The ex-con shook his head. Because once, someone stopped for me when I didn't deserve it, Mike said. We just keep passing that mercy down. Those words stayed with him like an anthem, a reminder that redemption wasn't meant to be hoarded. It was meant to be shared. And as the sun set on another long day, the man watched a new generation of kids laughing on the playground he had helped build. Their joy was pure, unfiltered, and loud enough to drown out the ghosts of his past. In that sound, he heard the truth. His life had come full circle. He had been forgiven not just to be free, but to help others find freedom too. The following spring, a storm hit the town. Heavy winds tore through the streets, flooding the outskirts and damaging several buildings, including the youth center. When the ex-con arrived the next morning, water dripped from the ceiling, shattered glass covered the floors, and the walls they had built with so much care were scarred once again. For a moment, he stood frozen, the sight of destruction threatening to bring back the old voice in his head, the one that whispered he would always ruin everything he touched. But before despair could take hold, the distant rumble of engines filled the air. One by one, the bikers arrived, parking their motorcycles in the mud without hesitation. They walked through the broken doors and stood beside him silently. Iron Mike placed a firm hand on his shoulder and said, "You already know what to do, brother. We rebuild." Those 3 words were enough to silence the doubt that had begun to creep in. He nodded, took a deep breath, and got to work. The community joined in almost instantly. Parents, children, and neighbors arrived with tools, paint, and food. The same people who had once judged him now followed his lead. It was no longer his redemption story. It was their movement. Everyone had a hand in restoring what the storm had taken. It was as if the universe had given them one final test, to see if what they had built together was strong enough to withstand not just time, but trials. Days passed, and the sound of rebuilding became the heartbeat of the town once again. The ex-con worked from dawn to dusk, leading crews of volunteers, patching roofs, sanding walls, and reminding everyone that no setback could erase their progress. "We fall," he told the children, "but we rise stronger every time." Those words echoed through the community like a vow, a promise that no storm, no failure, and no past could undo the power of perseverance. When the last wall was restored, the man stood in front of the building and looked up at the newly painted sign, the Road Home Youth Center. He smiled through tears, realizing the name carried a deeper meaning than he had ever imagined. The road home wasn't a place, it was a journey, one that every soul had to take at least once in their life. Months later, the town gathered for the 1-year anniversary of the youth center. The crowd was larger than ever. Families, friends, and strangers who had heard about the story and traveled miles to see it for themselves. Children ran through the halls, laughter spilling out into the streets. The air was filled with music, the smell of barbecue, and the hum of motorcycles parked in perfect rows along the fence. It wasn't just a celebration, it was a testimony. The ex-con took the stage, his leather jacket worn and faded, the word brotherhood still stitched proudly across the back. He looked out at the faces before him, at the men who had given him a second chance, and at the children whose futures were now brighter because of it. For a long moment, he said nothing, just took it all in. Then, with a voice steady and full of emotion, he said, "You all taught me that the past doesn't define us. What defines us is what we choose to build after." The crowd erupted in applause. Iron Mike stepped forward, gripping his shoulder with pride. "You built more than walls here," he said. "You built faith in yourself and in all of us." The man smiled, his eyes glistening. "No," he replied softly. "We built it. Together." It wasn't humility. It was truth. Everything that stood before them was proof of what happens when compassion wins over judgment. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, the bikers revved their engines in unison, their sound echoing through the hills like a song of victory. The man stood watching them, the children waving goodbye, the sky painted in gold and crimson. He felt the same wind that once carried his guilt, now carrying peace through his chest. He had been a prisoner of his past, but now he was a guardian of hope. And as the night settled, the town lights shimmered over the youth center like stars guiding lost souls home. For everyone who had ever fallen, this place was proof that there's always a road back, a road built by mercy, brotherhood, and second chances. When the noise of the crowd faded and the last engines grew quiet, the man stood before the youth center once more. The building gleamed beneath the streetlights, not as a monument of concrete and steel, but as a living symbol of what grace can build. He thought of the journey, the cold streets, the judgmental eyes, the endless guilt, and how a handful of strangers on motorcycles had turned that pain into purpose. The road he once walked alone was now shared by hundreds, all carrying pieces of the same redemption he once begged for. Redemption, he realized, isn't a finish line. It's a road that never ends. It's found in every act of compassion, every hand that reaches down instead of turning away. He had fallen lower than most, but that fall had taught him the truth that too many forget. Broken people can still build beautiful things. His scars no longer marked his shame. They told the story of survival. And through them, others had learned that forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the greatest form of strength. Iron Mike's words still echoed in his mind. We just keep passing mercy down. That mercy had become his compass. Every nail driven, every child taught, every mile ridden was another reminder that the world doesn't change through power. It changes through grace. And though his past would always exist, it no longer defined him. It refined him. What had begun as an act of pity had become a movement of love, proof that light is never truly gone, even when we're standing in the dark. He turned toward the sound of distant laughter, the children, the bikers, the families all gathered under the glow of hope. He smiled, realizing that this story was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough, everyone who believed they'd run out of chances. Because sometimes, all it takes is one act of kindness to rewrite an entire life. If this story moved you, let it live beyond the screen. Share your thoughts below. Your words might be the mercy someone else needs to hear. And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, stay with us. Subscribe, like, and be part of this journey where redemption still rides and hope never runs out of road.